Hey Harry, how you doing today, mate?
Hey Todd, yeah, great, thanks. How are you?
Oh, I'm awesome. I'm awesome. So you're joining us from the Sunshine Coast in Australia, and first international guest on the podcast. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
My
pleasure.
first question is, well, actually, I tell you what. If you start with an introduction to yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I'm a youth strength and conditioning coach here in Australia. I've created a business around this called the Youth Athletic Development Academy, and through this, I deal with a wide variety of people from 5-year-olds looking to improve their physical development and their physical literacy, all the way through to youth athletes looking to improve their performance and stay injury free and just remain in their peak level.
And on the subject of physical literacy, one of the traps I find myself falling down is I'll get used to speaking with S&C coaches and I'll throw out terms such as physical literacy, but then I'll forget when I'm talking to parents that what their idea of physical literacy is and what my idea is. There might be two different things. So for listeners who might be parents or sport coaches or might have their own definition, how do you define physical literacy?
Yeah, so I guess my definition of physical literacy is just having the capacity and the confidence to move in a way that helps you with your sporting activities, like your kicking, hitting, tumbling, striking the ball, anything to do with that. So it's quite a broad term, but yeah, encompasses a lot.
And perfect. And have you always worked with youth athletes, or is that something you've fallen into?
Yeah, so always worked with youth athletes. I initially started working with youth athletes as a tennis coach. So spent a lot of time if through from the teenage years through university and even up to a little bit now, working with youth tennis players. And yeah, this was a relatively easy process to move into the strength and conditioning space, dealing with the same demographic.
And just a more specific question on the tennis. Obviously, you played yourself, and you said off air that you had a decision where you could have gone to the States and chose to remain in Australia. How much of your S&C coaching, if you will, how much of that was done on court versus in a gym?
Yeah, initially a lot of it was based on court, whether that was 15 minutes before a training session done as a warm up, or during a session or after a session, just getting in whatever work I could, and then slowly transitioned into the gym facilities when I had that available to myself.
And what are some of the common mistakes that you see? What are some of the common mistakes you see with tennis athletes and their S&C, whether it's looking back on your own career or whether it's with some of the youngsters you first started working with?
I think the biggest mistake is just not taking it seriously. There's not a massive culture, at least in the youth setting, around tennis and strength and conditioning here in Australia. Um, yeah, so I'd say that's probably the number one thing, and that was definitely my mistake as well. I didn't do a lot of strength and conditioning work as a kid, and I definitely paid for that later on with a string of injuries and unreached potential, I guess.
And it's funny you say in regards to not taking it seriously, because one of my previous podcast guests, Daz Drake, who works predominantly in tennis, he spoke about his physical model, his technical model, and he said before even diving into any of that, he'll ask his coaches whether the player was actually trying their hardest, because obviously all of that is irrelevant if your player isn't putting in 100%. So my next question is, when it comes to the developing psychosocial skills in kids and sort of that battle hardiness of trying, how do you factor that into your planning of your sessions or how you coach your sessions?
Yeah, so I like to create a lot of challenges in my sessions to help develop this. I like athletes to get that sense of accomplishment that they feel when they achieve a task, or when they do something that they may have previously not been able to do. And I get another aspect of this um, would be in the academy challenges that I've created as well. So these academy challenges help to build the skills that we've worked on throughout the term and throughout the training block to help these athletes get better and to build this growth mindset around their training.
So my next question on the subject of the challenges is, firstly, can you give an example of these? Because I've seen some brilliant ones that I've stolen from you on Instagram. But just give an example of what these challenges are. And then my second question is, how do you frame failure when a kid can't do a challenge? Because obviously it's almost become common in sport where we lower the bar so far that every kid can jump over it, every kid gets a medal, but then the kids know it's meaningless. So what are the challenges? How do you frame failure?
Yeah, so one of the challenges I've done is, one of my favorite ones is probably a 1-minute skipping challenge. The reason why this is probably one of my favorites is there's a low barrier to entry in it. Most kids can skip, and if kids can't skip, they can learn to skip. And setting this challenge for kids to improve on day to day, week to week is key. And I found the kids really get into this, especially when there's that lower barrier to entry where kids may not feel that fear to give it a go. And yeah, a great example of this is, I had a kid who barely could string together any skips, and from setting this challenge, he probably gave it 50 odd attempts. He was in there most days just digging away at it, trying to get better with his skipping, and obviously he improved a lot throughout the time, and that's exactly what I want to see. So with regards to the failure, you may be able to not do it today, but I like to put that growth mindset in, that if you want to keep working at it, you will be able to improve and get better. Yeah,
and I think that's a key point, that it's easy for kids to be like, oh, well, I'm not as good as so-and-so, or compared to everyone, I'm down here. But it's not the actual challenge per se. Like, it's not necessarily the art of learning how to skip. It's the idea of forcing yourself to commit the time to then go and get better, rather than the actual, skipping, or even though it has its benefits, it's that rather than whatever the specific challenge is in itself. So have you found the responses to be fairly positive on the whole from the kids then?
Yeah, 100%. The kids have loved it, and for me, it gives me a bit of an insight into where their mind's at as well. I get an insight as to whether the athlete has got the mindset where they can't do it and then they give up, or maybe they can't initially do it and they keep going, or maybe they even excel at it and they're just going to give it one attempt and see how they go with that, which is obviously not ideal as well.
So one of the things I've learned most from working in a school and working alongside PE teachers over the past 2 years is being able to differentiate tasks relative to the obviously the people doing it. Now, obviously in S&C, we think we do this all the time in terms of progression and regression. So my next question is, let's say you've got an idea of an athlete's mindset from these challenges, how does that then influence your programming going forward?
Yeah, so I guess it creates a bit of a floor from where I can build on. So if I know someone struggles with that growth mindset, I may set some challenges a little bit lower. I'm going to build some confidence in that athlete, give them the skills that they need to, and possibly spend a little bit more time working on the skills, making sure it's refined. And then from there, I can set challenges that I know they can complete, and then challenges that will start to challenge them a little bit more. And then from there, they see that change in their mindset. And it's a great realization to see, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more enjoyable things about coaching. Obviously, it's nice to see someone have a massive broad jump or be really reactive off the floor, but it's seeing kids who go from not being able to do something to having a huge smile on their face when they put the time and effort to doing something they previously couldn't do. Like, that is where the money is.
Yeah, 100%.
We spoke off air about the obviously myself being lucky enough to go to Wimbledon a couple of weeks ago, and you said about how amazing it was that the top three just keep getting better. How do you instill this sort of attitude towards wanting to get better within the youth athletes that you work with?
Yeah, it's tough. It's it's something that in a lot of cases it's innate within them. So these top three players with Federer, Djokovic, and Nadal, they're hungry. They want more, and they've got that belief as well. And they're also there helping to push each other to help them raise the bar. So that's something I like to create as well. Is I like to tell the athletes that you need to surround yourself with other athletes that can help push you in the direction that you need to go. And on top of that as well, it's about creating that team around you as well to help drive you, whether that's your coaches or your parents or the other staff around you.
And in regards to that sort of team around you, how do you go about, so I've got one of your posts in front of me. It said that Australians, there was a 70% increase in injuries requiring knee reconstruction the past 15 years. So before I get into the second part of the question I had, why do you think there's been such a huge increase? Is it just because we're understanding and we're profiling and recording these injuries better, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I'm sure there's multiple factors that are going into this, but at the end of the day, I think it comes down to an early specialisation factor, especially because the most alarming thing about that study was the fact that the highest rate of incidence were these children amongst were between 5 and 14 years of age, and I think the main driving factor behind that definitely is that early sports specialisation. And also on top of that, it's the lack of training that these kids are getting in their grassroots and club level. When I say training, I mean their strength and conditioning coaching around their neuromuscular strength and proprioception and motor control.
And going back to what I mentioned about physical literacy, how do you define stuff like neuromuscular control or proprioception? What does that mean to the lay person?
Yeah, so just that connection between what your brain is trying to get your muscles to do and connecting. So if I say move my right arm here, my right arm's going to move there, or push hips back, or anything like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember, and obviously I'm sure you've experienced the same, when you get athletes from, for example, movement-based sports like gymnastics or dance, you tell them one thing and boom, they can do it. And I remember working with, and this isn't meant to stereotype, but I remember working with a group of young rowers and trying to teach them hip hinge. And I was like, right, hips back.
Yeah.
No, that's your knees, hips back.
Yeah.
Touch your bum to the wall. How do you go about to phrase the question better? Obviously, there's a lot of stuff out there about early specialization, what we can do to combat it. So my question is, if a kid comes to you, let's say specifically on the premise that they want to be coached tennis, obviously you can't dedicate an entire hour of tennis coaching towards S&C because that's not what they came to see you for. So how do you get that S&C in there while still keeping a good balance of what they paid you to come and see you for, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so you're talking about my experiences as a tennis coach. So if I'm running a tennis lesson, is that
Yep, perfect.
Where you're coming from?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the warm-ups are a great way to do this, and you don't need a lot of time as well. You can take 10 minutes of the session to run through some specific exercises that are going to help kids learn how to move and build strength and build their athletic foundation. And if you're doing a warm-up with a kid 3 times a week, maybe for 3 training sessions, that 10 minutes that's 30 minutes a week, and that 30 minutes a week adds up throughout the years. And while you would like to get kids in for more time, that 10 minutes is better than anything else.
So let's say you have what age kids did you work with firstly when you were doing just your tennis coaching?
Yeah, every age spectrum. 5 years through till 18, 20.
Okay, perfect. So let's say a kid comes to you at 5 and they happen to be really committed. So they'll be with you from, let's say for the sake of a round number, from 5 to 20. Obviously the warm-ups are a great use of time in terms of disguising in movement skill and strength and getting them to move the way that they should move. So what would a warm-up look like for, let's say a 5-year-old? So a kid who is definitely prepubescent, and perhaps doesn't have the ability to take on larger instructions. So let's say 5 versus, I don't know, a little bit older, 12, and then after puberty, what would those warm-ups, or what would your thought processes look like to those warm-ups for really young child, to pre-puberty to post-puberty?
Yeah, so I guess it's all the same thing, just working along a different continuum. So at the bottom of the continuum, you've got the 5-year-old who obviously does not have much of an attention span, doesn't want to be doing any specific drills and hearing 1,000 different cues. For that kid, it's all about just getting them to move, whether that is through different movements like crawling or passing or kicking, or just getting some different kind of stimuluses into them. Because if they're playing a lot of tennis, they're not getting a lot of other different activities in. So building that wide kind of movement literacy is important. And then moving into the 12-year-olds, you can start adding in some different movements, such as you might start working on some push-ups or some other fundamental movement skills, such as squatting or pushing up or rowing and such. And then moving into the later years, you might start to incorporate more specific exercises around dealing with different stability and mobility around joints. And then obviously you will still work in some games, because it's important to keep it fun throughout, whether that's through agility or speed or different team-based activities.
And I haven't written this down on my podcast prep that I sent you, so you can take a couple of minutes on this if you will. So a post I saw a few weeks ago was of Roger Federer's warm-up from start to finish. And it had a lot of interesting stuff around what I assume was targeting perceptual motor qualities. So, for example, in it, he was obviously using the racket and the ball, but then he was hitting, there was a football or a volleyball or something with another football, and just differentiating the stimulus. Do you ever do anything to target the perceptual motor skills of the athletes you work with?
I do, but generally speaking, I will stick to the foundation. I'll stick to the basic principles and keeping things simple as well, especially when I deal with someone and they've only got very limited amount of time. I will stick with a lot of the basics and getting those basics done well. And while, it's important to deal with those perceptual skills, it's something that comes along possibly later on in the development.
And going back to your S&C based sessions, you've got your mini movers, so your 5 to 8 year olds, and your kid fit group, 9 to 12. How different are these sessions in terms of how you coach, structure, and what you're trying to get out of the kids from those sessions?
Yeah, so essentially there's not too much difference, as I spoke to about before. There's like a continuum that I'll go up and down depending on the age levels of the group. With the mini movers, we'll work on skills and qualities around physical literacy, and as we will do the same sorts of things with our kid fit athletes, but we may start to incorporate different movements around fundamental skills like pushing up and bracing the core and such, and then as well building in more specific exercises and games around reaction and speed and agility.
And going back to that study that we mentioned a few minutes ago, what role do you think load monitoring may have played in the dramatic spike in knee injuries that Australia was seeing? And the second part of that question is, how do you communicate to parents and youth athletes about the importance of load monitoring while still trying to keep sport fun? Because I think a lot of time parents think, you just want little Timmy not to play football, or, if that's the one sport they're interested in, obviously they're going to do it. But how do you strike the balance between, yes, I want your kid to enjoy sport, but I also care about them and don't want them to get injured?
Yeah, 100%. And that load monitoring is a massive factor, and it goes hand in hand with the early sport specialisation as being one of the key factors to why that 70% increase in ACL injuries are there. So, sorry, what was the second part of that question as
The
well?
second part of the question is, how do you communicate to parents and youth athletes about the importance of load monitoring and do it in such a way where they don't think you're just trying to simply restrict the amount of sport that their kid is playing?
Yeah, it just comes from that open communication, and it building that trust with the parents and the athlete as well is key. Um, if you don't have that trust from based on your previous experience with them, it's very hard to communicate that with them, especially if they're a little bit apprehensive. So for me, I may not necessarily bring it up until if I feel like they're not able to take the advice, if I haven't built the relationship with them first and built that trust.
And in regards to, obviously, when you do it in older athletes, it might be easier to say, right, here's a spreadsheet. I want you to log how long you play the sport for, how intense it is. And then obviously you can spit out metrics and get them. You can be a bit more specific and say, right, you've done X amount last week, so therefore you're not going to do more than this and you're not going to do less than this. How does that work in a youth athlete setup where cognitively the kids may not be as mature and obviously parents have got a million other things concerning them? How do you try and go down that official route, or do you give general prescriptions in terms of, right, if you train X amount of times per week, have one day off or whatever? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's so different with everyone I speak to. It's I try not to make those kind of hard and fast rules about one training session equals such and such time away. But yeah, it's definitely my number one hardest thing to deal with, is getting these kids to recover from their training and to recover effectively, and that education around making sure that they're doing the right things in regards to their big rocks of recovery, whether that be your nutrition, hydration, or sleep. So yeah.
And one of the things you've written about previously is about the minimum effective dose. So my first part of the question is, for people who aren't familiar with the term, where does it come from and what does it mean?
Yeah, so the minimum effective dose for me is just what stimulus can we give these athletes to give them the most effect without causing them any issues in their recovery and their performance in their sport throughout the week.
And the second part of that is, what do you think are appropriate? And I know this will obviously change depending on the athlete, but what do you think are appropriate starting volumes? Let's say you get a kid in the gym and they've never lifted weights, but they move pretty well. So you decide, right, you've earned the right to use a little bit of weight. What are your sort of starting volumes, or what is your minimum effective dose, if you like, for a kid that's just starting in the strength and conditioning suite?
Yeah, so most of the kids that I deal with, they're because of the nature of S&C here, they've typically got a training age of 0. So we're starting right at the bottom. We're building skills. I'm teaching kids how to move, and typically this doesn't create too much of a fatigue effect. And from this, I slowly build up in all the typical different ways through weight and reps and time and tempo and all of those things. And I remain that open communication with the athlete to see how they're responding to their training and how they're faring throughout the week and whether that's affecting what's going on throughout.
And there's something I'm finding, and maybe it's just because obviously I've worked with kids a lot more recently. But for example, in the 2 years I've been at a school, like, I remember doing a set of walking lunges just as part of a warm up. And then the next day, the pupils were saying to me, "Oh, my legs are really sore from what we did yesterday." And I was thinking, what, the warm up? And have you found in the years you've been working with youth athletes that there's been either a decline in physical literacy, or kids are being even less exposed to it?
Yeah, I find they are getting less exposed to it, and I think that comes down to the focus on the skills of their sport. Kids aren't spending the time on that development, and yeah, you do find kids who you think would respond relatively well to a program, but then come back obviously very sore and feeling that session the next day.
And in regards to the minimum effective dose, you said obviously about your work as a tennis coach. Are there other tennis coaches at the school that you're associated with?
Yeah, a handful.
Perfect. So my next question is, obviously you've got your minimum effective dose in the gym, and you can quite easily, even though it's a theoretical concept, you could quite easily apply it to, for example, how much time you spend on the court, how intense the sessions need to be. Have you ever found yourself in a position where you've tried to influence what other tennis coaches are doing with their athletes at the school in terms of how much volume or intensity that they're giving a certain pupil? Or do you try and stay out of that and just say, look, I'm not coaching the athlete, it's not my concern, if that makes sense?
No, I'm quite lucky where I am that a lot of the coaches that I deal with are very receptive to all of this, and they've got great buy-in with the program that I run and belief in the systems. So yeah, that's good on that side. That does make life a lot easier for me, and of course the athlete gets the benefit of that as well. But again, that comes down to building that trust with the coaches. So I've had the benefit of working with the tennis coaches there for a handful of years and integrating the program through them. And so luckily that integrative approach there has really helped the athletes out in helping them to not only perform better, but on the injury side of things with dealing with the loads.
And I suppose it helps the athletes massively if obviously what's being preached on court is being preached in the gym and everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah, 100%.
And with in terms of building trust, do you think in terms of the mistakes that S&C coaches make, you obviously said that you were lucky enough, you were in the tennis team before, the kids probably knew you, the tennis coaches knew you, obviously the school knew you. How often do you think S&C coaches make the mistake of almost trying to bulldoze their way into an organization and, you know, dare I say it, almost trying to go too hard with the relationship too soon without being able to actually spend time to build that trust, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think it's important to be humble and just to realize the effect that the effect of us as strength and conditioning coaches of being on performance. And at the end of the day, we're a small piece of the puzzle compared to what they're doing in their sport training. So we need to realize our role and not think that we're above any sport coach or that our job is more important than others, because at the end of the day, it's not. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's not anything more than that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in my younger days as an S&C coach, for me, every limitation that led to a flaw in somebody's sport, so that's definitely physical. Oh, they're definitely not strong enough. And then like even silly things like yesterday, I had a kickabout with my brother, and I playing goal, and I don't know. I assume it's called soccer in Australia, but I potentially exposing my lack of international knowledge. But yeah, and I was obviously practicing diving and got nowhere near the ball, and I was like, well, in my older S&C days, I've been like, definitely a physical limitation. But then I'm like, I've not played the sport in years, so and you know, from my powerlifting background, I'd like to think I'm quote unquote strong enough, whatever that means. So that's why I asked the question about the perceptual skills earlier on, just because in my younger days, everything was a physical limitation, and it's, you know, the strongest athlete, the quickest athlete will always be the best athlete. But we've all had athletes who tear it up in the gym, and then you see them in their sport and they're actually not all that.
Yeah, well, that's it. Like jumping performance, sprinting performance, we test and we can see someone's fast or can jump high in the gym, but jumping looks different in basketball than it does volleyball, looks different than it does in soccer. Jumping is very sport specific, and it's hard to measure it in the gym and say, yep, that person's going to be able to perform out on the field or the court.
And in regards to performing on the court, obviously with your tennis knowledge of having played the sport, I'm assuming you've probably got a general or generic S&C testing battery. Do you try and watch the athlete on court and then either match up what you perceive to be a deficiency on the court and the physical limitation, or do you try and build that picture of, right, here's their physical limitations, this is what we're seeing on the court, here's how it might link up? Or do you try and just say, right, these are just some generic metrics, this is what we're working on, and dare I say, almost try and keep the two, try not to overstep your role, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I think ideally that would be great if I was to take the time to be on the tennis court to analyze their movement and see what I feel like their limitations are, and use that experience as a tennis coach and then transfer that over to the gym. But the practicality of being able to do that is difficult, and the limitations in time of not only the kids but the other coaches and myself. It's tough to do in the real world, but ideally that would be great.
And going back to on the subject of testing, Barry, I saw a brilliant thing on Instagram where you were using a bike as a prowler, which I thought was just genius. So
yeah,
my
what next, you got to do.
Exactly. It's one of my favorite inventions that I've seen. What does your I don't know exactly the facilities you've got available at your disposal, but what does your basic testing battery look like for youth athletes?
Yeah, it's fairly simple. I like not to overcomplicate it. That's definitely a philosophy of mine, especially dealing with youth athletes, is to just make things simple. So I guess I've got two sorts of performance testing batteries, I guess I use. I've got one for my primary school kids, where I'll deal a lot more with the coordination and the physical literacy side of things, and I'll also test their jumping and their running and things of such. But when we get into the high school one, I'll do a bit more movement assessment. I'll look into their global movements, such as possibly an overhead squat and a bird dog, and assess that mobility and stability around their joints, as well as those other performance metrics.
And with the coordination side of things, it's an area I've become really interested of late, especially with younger kids, because I think, just because an athlete moves well enough to justify being loaded. So let's say, I don't know, they squat well, so you think, right, great, give them a dumbbell goblet squat. But another thing I've been playing about with is different means of getting into that squatting position, whether it's, I don't know, forward roll into a squat, or, something more coordination based. How do you assess the coordination? Are you filming stuff? Are you just sort of noting stuff in a diary and noting the change over time? Because I find coordination is a bit of a, dare I say, a fuzzy term that some strength and conditioning coaches who like the numbers aren't so comfortable with.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It is a fuzzy term, and coordination. It's not one. It's not one thing. It's the relationship between a whole lot of physical skills, such as your balance, your rhythm, your timing, and the connection between hand-eye, hand-foot coordination as well. It's not just one thing, and it's tough to define. But I like to, when I'm testing for these things, I like to do a variety. I like to test rhythm through skipping. I'll test hand-eye coordination through a variety of different throwing activities, and then I'll also do balance testing as well.
I like it. I was going to say the next place I was going with the questioning was going to be something about how you either assess rhythm or teach rhythm, because I find that a lot of kids, they've almost got two ends of the spectrum, but they've got like nothing in between. So if you say, right, run as fast as you can, they'll sprint away. If you say move very slowly, they will. But they almost can't, what's the word I'm looking for? They can't find the in-between. It's either jump as fast or as far as possible, sprint as fast as they can, or move very slowly and, barely walk.
And you can play around with those tempos in all of those different tasks as well. So you can take a skipping challenge and you can tell them, all right, you've got 30 seconds to do 50 skips. And then I can give them a challenge to say, you've got 30 seconds to do 70 skips. And their goal for that is to figure out how close they can get to that number. and we can change the rhythms around as well. We can do juggling challenges where they'll be juggling at different rhythms, throwing balls at different times, whether that's to a count or to a metronome or something like that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I found a lot of stuff that helps with, because for me, for example, loads of kids want to focus on how far they can jump or how fast they can run. But as we were saying earlier, they don't necessarily want to focus on, should we say, the more basic or what they perceive to be boring, such as landings or running efficiently. So I find, similar to what you said, rather than, for example, using an external cue of throwing a cone miles away and be like, right, try and reach the cone. Sometimes even pulling that back and be like, right, can you modify how much force you're putting into the ground to only jump this far? And almost constrains their landing without even thinking about it. And then they try and overexert themselves. And then, as you said, going back to the ACL study, you start to see all the discrepancies in movement efficiency that ironically probably lead to these issues later down the line if we don't fix them from the get-go.
Yeah, 100%. And I had a great challenge for my mini movers class this week that was along that line of setting a cone a certain distance apart and having them shut their eyes, and I would tell them, you've got to get as close to this cone in a certain number of jumps, and I found this to be a great challenge to test this and to develop.
Do they? I think I don't. You may have stolen it from the same place. You may have invented it yourself. I saw Brett Kilka put something out like that a week or so ago. Do they jump with their eyes? Do they jump with their eyes closed, or?
Yeah, look, I may have actually taken that from Brett. I do follow a lot of his stuff. Yes, they do have their eyes closed and they're jumping from one cone to the next. Is that similar to what Brett's done? Yeah,
literally line a load of cones up. You've got 5 jumps. Just try and get from here to here, which I thought was interesting. Because I thought depending on which group depending on the ability level of the group, you might have someone who's super springy who then has to sort of cut a bit off, and equally you might have someone who is relatively or has a zero training age, never been taught how to jump or land, and for them that's 5 maximal jumps as far as possible.
Yep.
And in regards to recommended resources, if you had to pick just one, whether it's a podcast, something online, YouTube, whatever, what would you go for?
Yeah, so Brett Kilka is actually someone that I definitely would recommend for anyone dealing with the pre-adolescent age group. He puts out lots of great content on his website, so he's definitely someone that I've lent on quite a lot, especially with the development of these the mini movers and kid fit programs. As for podcasts, I do love podcasts, and I think Mike Robertson's podcast is great. I think it's called the Physical Preparation Podcast.
Yeah,
I know he puts out a lot of great interviews with wide variety of guests. So they'd probably be a couple I'd recommend.
Awesome. And having been lucky enough, or depending on what field you're in, unlucky enough to do 3 years worth of internship work, I've got a lot of experience working with different coaches. So my question is, if you could spend a period of time observing one coach and their athletes, who would you choose to observe and why?
Yeah, so I've been, when I was a young coach, I would follow a lot of Gary Schofield's work.
Oh, love Gary Schofield.
So yeah, he's been doing a lot of great work over in the States with who previously was high school strength coach and president of the National High School Strength and Conditioning Association. So he's someone I'd love to spend some time with. And obviously we've talked about Brett over the last couple of minutes. He'd be another person I'd love to pick his brain on.
Yeah, Gary Schofield's got a brilliant, I think it's something like Training the High School Athlete or something like that, on YouTube, and the passion just literally flies off the video. Like, you watch it and you think, right, let me find some youth athletes, let me go and coach. Like, he's brilliant.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And my last question is, how can people get in touch with you or find out more about the Youth Athlete Development Academy?
Yeah, so personally, you can find me on Instagram. My personal page there is coach_Harry W, or you can email me at harry@yadacademy.com. If you want to find more information about the Youth Athletic Development Academy, you can visit the website, yadacademy.com, or you can just jump over to the Instagram page at YAD Academy.
Perfect. And thank you very much for your time, Harry. As I said, first international guest on the Platform to Perform podcast. So thank you for mitigating the time difference. And it's been a pleasure to speak to you, mate.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Todd. Appreciate it.
All the best, mate. Take care.
Bye.